than an academic conference only.
That's great. I'm excited and surprised that you were able to make it on such short notice.
Well, please don't be surprised. Even if my flight is tomorrow, and even if it weren't, I probably would have tried to accommodate this.
Okay, great. I'm curious to know more about the talk that you gave in Milan as well.
Okay, I'll try to frame it in the context of our discussion today. And if there's a chance to bring it up, I will, because that's freshest on my mind.
I was interested in the design sub-theme of SHOT this year, because that's not always the case. I was on the executive council for many years, and I took this year off because I'd gone to so many conferences in a row. But then lo and behold, I found myself a couple hours away. Yeah. And then looking at the program with a bit of curiosity.
Yeah, the design panels, and I think there were 2 or 3 of them. One of them I didn't make it to. That was called Nature by Design, I believe. That was yesterday. So I have no information on that. But the other 2 panels, which were relevant to design as a field, were organized by Jana Boiva, who is a former colleague of mine at York University in Toronto. She's now based in Germany. And it was a welcome addition, as I understood. It was my first time at SHOT. Obviously, as you would know better than me, there's a very strong historical bent to most of the content that is expressed there. But I think it was very well received, particularly the second session that Jana had organized on community and materiality. Irena Posch, Daniela Rosner, Kostas Latoufis from the University of Athens, and oh goodness, who was the 4th person? Please forgive me. I chaired the panel too. Amy Slayton was from University
from Drexel, I think.
From Drexel, right? From Drexel was the commentator. And it was all very fabulous. And the surprising thing about that was something that you're just, insinuating, is that it wasn't just like design name, it was full-on design. And then what I mean in that sense is that there was no historical perspective in their talks. And but it was nevertheless very well received by the audience, and the comments were just fantastic.
I also wanted to see Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglin's exhibit on AI.
Yeah. Most people did. There was a lot of chatter about it at the conference. Of course, most participants only being there 2 or 3 days and having a packed schedule. I don't know how many people eventually did make it. There was a symposium yesterday, and I can't remember the name of the scholar who was on that panel, but there was a lot of interest among the SHOT community to try to attend that symposium, and I wasn't able.
I don't know if we're on air yet. It might be completely.
There was a 10-second countdown, but I didn't hear the numbers.
It might be.
I'm watching live, and the bunker seems to be empty.
It does. Oh no, it's always empty on YouTube. There's no video. It's just audio.
Oh, okay.
We're sitting in the bunker.
We're also specters.
But our phones don't work in the bunker, so we have no contact with the outside world.
With the outside world. How deep is the bunker? Do you know?
Not very deep at all, but it has thick concrete walls.
Yeah.
And it's a little cold. There's a pile of blankets.
Okay.
In case people are listening, I can audio describe what's happening inside the bunker.
We should do that.
Yeah, what does it sound like in there?
It's not too echoey because it's a narrow space, long space.
Yeah.
You can see the space online if you're on YouTube. It's
the
a little
echoes like triangulate and sort of phase each other out because of as I'm feeling, yeah.
What shape is this?
This would be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hexagon, yeah. But
it's a little damp.
Not an asymmetrical hexagon.
It's a little
Could you
damp.
clap so they can get a sense of the? Okay.
There's a few flying mosquito-type insects, which surprised and disappointed me. There are some very bright fluorescent lights installed, probably newly, right above our heads. And I think there's soundproofing on either end. this black material, which is probably making the sound better. We're sitting at a long wooden picnic table. We have some cookies and some hot tea and some water, which I think the table looks pretty clean in the video, but it's actually...
it's very antiseptic.
It's kind of homey, actually, in person.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there cats or dogs or?
There's no cats.
No pets.
In my heart, there are several cats, and I carry them with me.
There's a bunch of paper, but nothing to write with.
I have multiple apparatuses for writing if you require, and
our laptops are open.
Okay.
What about your space, Alexander?
Well, it's in my house. It's an office that's also my child's bedroom, so it's an awkward combination of my things and his things, and my dirty clothes and his toys.
Are they distinguishable?
At this point, I mean, you'd have to dig through the pile in order to sort them out. So, but I have a lot of writing implements. But it's a much less interesting environment. I'm sorry I can't be there in person.
Maybe I'll see you later this week, though, at Harmony's event.
Oh yeah, you're coming back when? In a couple days?
Tuesday. And that event is on Wednesday, I think.
Yeah, great. I was wondering if you'd be back in time.
In the
Please
very, very small world that this that this conversation has turned out to be, even though I haven't met Harmony or you before.
No, correct.
I feel like we should maybe introduce ourselves. I like the idea that we're having a conversation about a conference inside of another conversation about this biennial, but maybe we should just introduce ourselves.
Sure.
Yeah.
Assuming that we're on air.
Let's make that assumption, and if we're proven wrong, then we can reintroduce ourselves at that time.
Exactly.
Or unintroduce ourselves.
Or unintroduce stuff, and then proceed to introduce ourselves once more. Yes.
Alexander, do you want to start?
Yeah. I'll go. So my name's Alexander Provan. I'm joining remotely from New York, and I am a writer and editor, the editor of the magazine Triple Canopy, and we've been doing a lot of work related to sound and listening recently. Which is partly how the composition of this conversation came together as an emergence of those interests, and also includes a few people who are contributing to an upcoming issue that focuses on sound and listening. And I've actually previously participated in a bunker-ish talk organized by Lara. In a structure built by Lara that was not as bunker-ish, and it was made of wood, and it was at the Artissima Art Fair in Torino in 2012, I believe. So this is my second such experience with Lara.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually, this is Mara Mills, and I'll just say before I introduce myself, I'm very interested in where this discussing words in bunkers as part of art projects comes from, because I know that this very weekend, one of my friends is in Philadelphia participating in an art project by Allison Mitchell, who teaches, I think, at York, where you are located, which is called the Lesbian Haunted House, Killjoy's Castle, and they're discussing the word lesbian in the room of the haunted house. And when I realized that my friend and I were both discussing words in these other alternate spaces, it seemed like something was emerging there.
Yeah, it seems like the bunker is haunting contemporary art discourse.
Well, and my friend made the joke that lesbian could be discussed in a bunker just as well as in a haunted house, which I thought was funny as a lesbian myself. So I'm a professor of media studies, officially, my official identity, at New York University. My PhD is in history of science. And this is a field that lays claim, rightly or wrongly, it'll be interesting to see what everyone here thinks, to the invention of the paradigm concept as we understand it today in English. And I'll talk a little bit from my background as a historian of science.
Great. My name is Einar Engstrom. I am a former editor of Leap magazine, and thus was formerly based in Beijing, China. Currently, I am based in Toronto, Canada, and I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at York University. My dissertation is concerned with the history of synthetic sound. And I'll leave that at that, and see what I can draw from my project, or bring into what I can take from my project and bring into our conversation today. Yeah.
So we are all sound people. I didn't mention that I also work on the history of electroacoustics, and especially the history of research at AT&T, Western Electric, the Bell system. I think I only say one or two things about sound in the little material I prepared. I talk more about disease and disability.
Okay.
And I also should say I co-direct the Center for Disability Studies at NYU. So the things inflect a little bit about my reading and understanding of the history of the word paradigm. And I'm going to start mainly because I'm giving a historical overview, and I know that others will jump in with totally different methodological and theoretical perspectives on this word. And I should say, as I was thinking about the word paradigm, I realized I was much less interested in the meaning or multiple meanings of this word than I am in the origin of the term, and how it went viral, or as I'll discuss, bacterial in English in the 1960s. So if we rely on the ambiguous evidence of Google Ngram, we see immediately that paradigms are almost non-existent before 1962. And then they sort of jet off astronomically, or exponentially, I should say. So what was it that happened in that year? 1962 was the year, of course, that Thomas Kuhn published his tour de force, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Yes. So Kuhn was a physicist turned historian and philosopher of science, and in this book, he argued against the taken-for-granted understanding of scientific development at that time, specifically the positivist model of scientific facts or truths about the natural world, simply piling up in a linear, progressive way from the so-called scientific revolution beginning in Europe roughly in the 17th century onward. In his very title, Kuhn suggests instead multiple revolutions, revolutions as something endemic to science, and in fact regularized, having a predictable structure. Surveying the physical sciences, mostly in the 19th and 20th centuries, Kuhn concludes that far from a continuous mode of knowledge production, science was, in his words, a series of peaceful interludes punctuated by violent revolutions. And what constituted these revolutions? Something that Kuhn called paradigm shifts. Seems sort of neutral, but here it is, the cause of revolutions. So in this book, Kuhn elaborates his notion of paradigm, which had previously mostly been used as a grammatical term for a declension chart or pattern. We now popularly understand paradigm to have two somewhat contradictory senses. It can be either an entire worldview or framework for a field, or it can mean simply a prototype, a mere example. Scholars have found up to 22 distinct uses of the word paradigm in the structure of scientific revolutions, but Kuhn most explicitly defines the word as, and this is a quote from him, the entire constellation of beliefs, values, techniques, and so on, shared by the members of a given community, and the concrete puzzle solutions, which, employed as models or examples, can replace explicit rules as a basis for the solution of the remaining puzzles of normal science. So working inside a paradigm in a given discipline, and one cannot do otherwise, colleagues share training tools, explicit concepts, as well as tacit knowledge. Anything outside the paradigm, any novelty, Kuhn says, is continually ignored, derided, or explained away until one day a pattern of novelties grows so strong that it can no longer be suppressed. According to this trajectory, scientific revolutions begin as a series of anomalies in scientific practice, for instance, the discovery of X-rays in Röntgen's lab, when a cathode ray screen began glowing unexpectedly, and this turned into a recurrent event. The accretion of these anomalies then may develop into true crises, wherein they finally result in the adoption of a new paradigm by a particular scientific community. Now, when I looked through this packet of 46 images that Lara Favaretto gave to me, and I'm assuming gave to everyone here in advance of this event, it's 46 images that make up her personal archive or something like a Nemesine atlas for the word paradigm. I have to say, I think I was most perturbed, like even sort of disgusted and frightened by the photograph of the crocodile biting the trunk of an elephant. It's violent, but it's also an anomaly. It doesn't fit into the food web as I understand it. And even though a number of similar crocodile-elephant encounters circulated on the internet between 2010 and 2017, it actually became somewhat of a meme with different elephants and crocodiles involved. These incidents have yet to shift the existing ecological paradigm. If paradigm shifts happen, and if they're revolutionary, then an entire worldview, a whole interrelated network of concepts, not just a single node or interaction, is changed. A field's language changes, its concepts and models, as well as the very structure of its taxonomies. Kuhn writes that a paradigm shift alters not only the criteria by which terms attach to nature, but also massively the set of objects or situations to which those terms attach. It transforms not only the criteria relevant to categorization, but also the way in which given objects and situations are distributed among pre-existing categories. All right, so why does Thomas Kuhn's paradigm and its propensity to shift matter outside the natural sciences? If it isn't already obvious, the structure of scientific revolutions became one of the touchstones for the early constructivist or social constructionist movement. In my field of history of science, arguably, I should say, part of a bigger field of science and technology studies, schools of thought like the Strong program that emerged in the 1970s in Edinburgh shortly after Kuhn's publication began to argue that science was a culture and a pattern of behavior like anything else. Scientific knowledge had social determinants, money, national needs, technological setups. It was not simply a series of deductions from theory or a series of applications of the scientific method. Everything under the sun, from objectivity to gender, was suddenly understood to be socially constructed. Jean Piaget, a contemporary of Kuhn's and also a leading constructivist in the field of psychology, argued in his 1968 book, Structuralism, that Kuhn had even further influenced Foucault's notion of the episteme, announced by Foucault in The Order of Things, published in 1966. Foucault defined the episteme as, quote, the historical a priori that grounds knowledge in a given epoch, or the very conditions of possibility for knowledge. Foucault's theory is broader and more relativist than Kuhn's paradigm. An episteme can cross multiple fields. For instance, the episteme of modern acoustics, and here's my little nod to our common field of sound, spans architecture, physics, music, and literature. Our episteme thinks us. So paradigm shifts are the source of revolutions. Kuhn's paradigm itself became one of these shifts, away from determinate knowledge, pure scientific truths, and unmediated facts of any kind. It became a pillar of post-war, postmodern thought in the university. It was certainly at the roots of my training in the 1990s as someone trained in biology and English before going on into history of science. Okay, so many scholars in my field have actually complicated this lionizing narrative of Kuhn by pointing out that he himself was likely influenced by a Polish Jewish doctor who researched typhus in the early 20th century before being deported to Auschwitz, where he was asked to work on bacteriology, specifically to diagnose syphilis using serological tests, and this man was Ludwig Fleck. Here, I should just pause to thank the PhD students in my current Science and Technology Studies class for an extended discussion of Fleck and Kuhn earlier this semester, which really clarified my thoughts. And I felt it was very fortuitous then to be asked to talk about paradigm when I had been so well prepared by those discussions. So Fleck, who survived Auschwitz, had actually published in 1935 his Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, this book title, of course, translated from the original German into English. This little book was not widely read in its own time. And in fact, it took several decades to have any impact. But it was perhaps the first to ask the simple and devastating question, what is a scientific fact? He analyzes one case throughout the book, syphilis, or rather syphilology, a medical subspecialty that underwent a sea change with the creation of the Wassermann test in 1906. This test detected antibodies for syphilis in a person's blood. For 400 years prior, syphilis had been a source of medical confusion and everyday anguish across Europe. It was arguably the first disease understood to be sexually transmitted, and hence it was highly stigmatized. I was thinking this is a fitting topic for a clandestine talk. Syphilis is said to have been brought to Europe from the Americas by Columbus himself, or at least by his crew. The first publicized outbreak occurred in Naples in 1494, followed by numerous outbreaks in France, whence it became known as the French disease. By the 18th century, it's thought that 10% of the population in the UK was infected with the disease. Its symptomatology began with sores. It proceeded to a secondary stage of headaches, fatigue, and hair loss, among other symptoms, and it ended often many years later with a late stage of visual and muscular impairment and dementia. My grandmother and her parents were evicted from their small town in northern Sweden because my great-grandfather had brought syphilis into the town, Haparanda, after some sort of cross-country skiing sojourn to Finland. This sort of drove home to me how stigmatized syphilis was, how feared it was. My family managed to pass the medical inspectors at Ellis Island, and from there they moved to Detroit, where my great-grandmother then spent 10 years in Ypsilanti State Psychiatric Hospital, one of the largest in the country, with over 4,000 patients in the post-war period around the time she died there. Bacteriologists only identified the spirochete that causes syphilis in the first decade of the 20th century, following which Wassermann developed his test. Later, it was 1928, Alexander Fleming accidentally discovered penicillin, and then it wasn't until the 1940s that penicillin was mass-produced and widely available as a treatment. My great-grandfather lived to receive that treatment, my great-grandmother didn't. So for the 4 centuries prior to the 20th century, Fleck concludes that syphilis was a jumble. It was something maybe we might use in today's terms, we might call it an umbrella category, a jumble of the most diverse diseases: leprosy, scabies, tuberculosis of the skin, gonorrhea. It was understood either through astrological and religious terms as a fateful and sinful, in his words, scourge, or through the empirical terms of mercury treatment. In each of these domains, syphilis was understood to beget bad blood. So for Fleck, probably more so than Kuhn, there's an element of continuity rather than rupture between the newer bacteriological investigations of blood and earlier religious theories that sort of set the groundwork for thinking about syphilis in blood. It's important to note that when we follow syphilis, what we find is not just sex but race. Race as a crucial social explanans, if not for Fleck, then certainly for the inheritors of his line of thinking. For instance, the origin of syphilis has been the subject of much post-colonial debate within STS and within the sciences themselves. Might Europeans have misattributed pathology to the Americas and its inhabitants? Alternately, might the bacterium have originated in the Americas but mutated into something more harmful in Europe? Syphilis, moreover, stands at the origin of 19th century racial purity fears and their eugenic solutions, as well as 20th century bioethics debates. Think of the Tuskegee experiment, where black men with syphilis were observed untreated and uninformed about the possibilities of treatment until the 1970s. So Fleck doesn't offer the narrative one might expect for the modern redefinition of syphilis as a bacterial infection with specific and predictable sequelae. This narrative might be something like, Wassermann heroically applying the scientific method to achieve a new fact, or alternately, a technologically determinist narrative about the impacts of his test itself. Rather, he looks at the broader milieu of bacteriology outside of syphilology. One might say the bacteriological culture in which the Wassermann test itself incubated. Fleck is interested in what he calls in his book, and this is a direct quote, the cultural, historical dependence of epistemology, using terms, to me, strikingly similar to those of the present day, or what he calls the thought style which determines the formulation of every concept. A scientific fact, then, is, in his words, a thought-stylized conceptual relation which can be investigated from the point of view of history and from that of psychology. Thought styles aren't held by individuals, but rather emerge from thought collectives. Thinking is a supremely social activity, Fleck wrote, and a thought style is a directed perception. It's culturally constrained perception. Scientific facts change when a thought style is supplemented or transformed. But before that time, he says, and this is a quote, heretics who do not share this collective mood are rated as criminals by the collective and will be burned at the stake until a different mood creates a different thought style and different valuation. When change does come, it sweeps across the scientific community much like a paradigm shift. However, paradigms and thought styles are distinct from something like the sweep of fads. And here I'm thinking of Lara Favaretto's scan, also in her Paradigm image collection, of a faxed lipstick print from the Telegraph Kisses fad during the early days of facsimile, which was new to me and sort of sweet. But thought styles and paradigms are entire worldviews. They are longer lived than fads. And they change, as Fleck says, in response to signals of resistance, something like Kuhn's anomalies. So I was thinking that the form of a thought collective is perhaps as relevant to our project as it is, or as is, its influence on the subsequent concept of the paradigm. On the one hand, Fleck defines a thought collective as an esoteric circle within an established field, a small group of people who share training and habits and who intercommunicate regularly, in the case of science, through specialized publications, later popularizing the facts they make to a wider exoteric audience. But elsewhere he suggests that a thought collective, and this is his writing, exists whenever two or more persons are actually exchanging thoughts. This type of thought collective is transient and accidental, forming and dissolving at any moment. But even this type induces a particular mood, which would otherwise affect none of the members, and often recurs whenever these members meet again. When we came to this bunker, we were certainly not a thought collective. Well, perhaps we were, because we have some similar training, or perhaps in the realm of sound studies we are. Well, that remains to be seen. But when we emerge after 1, 2, 3, 4, however many hours we stayed in here, maybe we'll have created a new form of thought collective. Lara suggests that viewers of the objects in her Thinking Head archive, sort of a storeroom at the Central Pavilion, will hear our words as they are replayed in the background. They're quite quiet, but if it's not too noisy, you can hear the words of prior clandestine talks being played in the storeroom. And the result, she writes, will be something similar to a very advanced hyper-technological dimension and augmented reality. So will the viewers be drawn into our thought collective? Are the viewers listening right now? Are we being streamed right now into the storeroom? Shall we encourage them to remain unschooled, or perhaps to become heretics? I want to conclude with a few ways to reconsider the social shaping or social constructionist paradigm of the word paradigm. For one thing, Bruno Latour, a sociologist of science quite well known, already in the 1980s asked members of the STRONG program and others in the field of science and technology studies to take one more turn after the social turn, namely to take non-humans, whether that's technology or other animals, seriously as actors in our narratives and in the world. In his actor network theory vein, then, we might give the spirochetes as much agency as we give to thought collectives. I am a product of syphilis. It made me an American. It can perhaps be traced in my cells and in my familial affect. Secondly, new realism of the body and other recent theoretical trends in disability studies insist that social or social constructionist models of disability, disease, and impairment might be adequate for epistemology, but do not comprehend things like pain, fatigue, and death. There are moments when my epistemology, or when epistemology impacts phenomenology, no doubt, but there are certain elements of my experience that aren't transformed by knowledge or by language. Something like a migraine. My gender might be impacted and transformed, but something like having migraines might not. Similarly, across academic disciplines, scholars in the last 2 decades have taken up new materialisms, ontology, perhaps more than epistemology, or in the case of those of us who still do work in the tradition of historical epistemology, I count myself among those people, have taken up practices and techniques as much as thoughts, ideas, beliefs, and linguistic categories. Practices and techniques, of course, are mentioned by Kuhn, but they until recently were not studied quite as much. Lastly, many scholars have turned to what I think is inappropriately called post-critique. When Latour asked in the early 2000s in his article, "Why has critique run out of steam?" he was worried that what should have been a profoundly materialist constructionism had been misidentified with linguistic deconstruction, and more importantly, appropriated for all sorts of conservative social constructionist arguments such as climate denial. In this new academic paradigm shift, scholars seek modes of writing and analysis beyond the so-called hermeneutics of suspicion, things like reparative reading, description, speculation, and fabulation. So I'll pause here on my little academic tour focused on science studies and the history of the term paradigm as it was popularized in English out of my subfield, and turn it over. I don't know who wants to speak next, but I'll turn it over to someone else, and then we can have conversation.
Alexander, would you mind, given that you're more involved in this from an earlier point, it might give me a bit more time to be infected bacterially by your comments, and therefore say something a bit more meaningful.
I have a few comments or questions in response. Has Harmony arrived yet?
No, Harmony's not here.
Well, I guess my main question is simply like where we're left in terms of agency and shifting paradigms by this historical overview. And sorry, there's a bit of an echo, so I'm going to maybe keep the speaking to a minimum. But you describe epistemes as thinking us, and obviously there's a sense of the impossibility of truly thinking outside the paradigms that govern how we think, how we speak, and what we say and what we believe. At the same time, on a more popular or instrumental level, especially in relation to political theory, you have ideas like the Overton window, which hinge on strategies for shifting paradigms, for shifting what is thinkable, and for shifting which political ideas are viable. So I guess I'm wondering, Mara, since you are much, given your extraordinary knowledge of this subject as it relates to the history of science and like the various scholars who have theorized this term, what gulf, if any, exists between the paradigm as described by Kuhn and those who have followed him, and the more mundane but essential problem of shifting what is, changing what is thinkable and changing what kind of political action is probable, and what kind of strategies those entail in relation to these more theoretical ideas that about how like what we say and what we think is governed by forces that we can hardly even perceive except at a distance?
I think that's a good question, and I think, the other question I would have for you two and for Harmony would be, how has the word paradigm continued to accumulate meanings? I didn't look at the Oxford English Dictionary definition today. I probably haven't looked at it in a year or so, but I'm assuming there's a long list of meanings that have accumulated since the 1960s, many of which are on a smaller scale than the worldview scale that I was mostly discussing with Kuhn. As I mentioned, he also uses it in a smaller sense as like exemplar or pattern, or I should say like model. And I think, in the arts and in many fields, most of it, we're thinking of smaller scale paradigms, not the immersive episteme-like paradigm. So there's, the roots of how the term went bacterial in English, I think is tied to Kuhn. But that doesn't mean that today the way the word is used is owned by him.
No, but I mean, we have, those of us who have any training in the history of science might sense that that is the only possible definition left, right? Or it's the only one to which we have access, because the concept of the paradigm becomes paradigmatic in and of itself, and like Alexander just said, it is a source of concern to the extent that it almost doesn't allow us to think outside of it. And I'm not talking about the paradigm of our respective fields, but rather the concept of a paradigm as a constraint on possible thought actions, right? How that prevents us from accessing different models for thinking about not only thought, but modes of training, different habitus, and so on and so forth. But the very fact that we're here, I think, suggests that there are other possibilities, right? And the clandestine talks do, particularly as they insist on interdisciplinary interaction, right? And put us in very tight enclosed spaces, although, Alexander, you're slightly mediated. Does sort of remind us that, what did you say, Mara, that, hold on, it was quite brilliant. Where did I write on the other page? Oh yeah, correct. So being in the bunker here reinforces the impression that thinking is an overwhelmingly social activity. Being in this proximity kind of reveals, in a strange, acoustically determined, and also under a different mode of gravity, the way that human-to-human interaction, in addition to material interaction, has a certain command over the things we might say, think, do, and so on and so forth.
I mean, the question, to answer Alexander's question, I suppose, coming from the sciences, Kuhn and Fleck weren't asking the question of how do we make political or social change, although the folks they were investigating were certainly asking the question of, they thought they were asking the question often of how do we make scientific change? How do we invent something, or how do we discover new facts? And the sobering analysis of both figures is that even when someone thinks they're discovering a new fact, they're elaborating a set of facts within a given paradigm.
Right. There's no difference between discovery and justification, because they're ruled or determined by the exact same set of potential puzzle solutions. Right?
Which is to say that there are significant limits placed on what you can quote unquote discover.
And it's really a series of these anomalies, or it's a series of external events, which could be events, other fields. I think for Fleck, it would be, there's technological creations, there's discoveries in adjacent fields. It's basically this emergent moment where a number of discoveries coalesce. Actually, he has an amazing quote. Yeah, he says that science is an excited conversation among several persons, all speaking simultaneously among themselves, and each clamoring to make himself heard, yet which nevertheless permitted a consensus to crystallize. And it's these like repeated crystallizations that are the thought styles of different thought, or the changing thought styles of thought collectives. I mean, there isn't really a single motor that you can point to in this theory of his. And I think the liberating part for Kuhn, when he first was coming up with this theory of paradigm shifts, was that he had been reading about Newton. This is, I think, an apocryphal story. I don't know if it's completely true. And he originally thought, how could he not have understood, I think he was thinking, how could he not have understood gravity, or how could he have not understood physics as we know it today? Sure. And then he eventually realized, previous science wasn't incorrect. It was just, it existed within a different paradigm. So he was, the origin of it was him trying to, lose the arrogance and the present-mindedness of scientists in his own time.
Yeah. And from that he developed this concept of incommensurability, where one thought collective in Fleck's terms, or one paradigmatic community of scientists in Kuhn's terms, revise and eventually replace their former ways of knowing with a brand new way of knowing in what he calls a process of revolutionary science, and lose the ability to understand what the former dominant mode of thought was doing and how it could be successful, right?
And this happens in our own fields. I mean, think of all the books published in the 80s called The Social Construction of Something, and no one would write a book with that title anymore because the paradigm has shifted.
But that does bring to me to the concern over our own time and how we invest ourselves in different forms of scholarship. And to be more specific, I'm thinking, when you're learning a field, when you're being trained, and I think that was one thing that Kuhn was really trying to express, that doing science, or formulating knowledge, was nothing less than a training in how to operate within one very particular framework. When we're doing that in any of our fields, be that the history of science, be that the tangential, or maybe just simply more recent science and technology studies, or critical theory, or political science, or what have you, where do we draw the lines between those things that we allow a passion for, and those that we reject outright? And those contours, to what extent do they rely on the simple question of temporality? Is this too old to be really taken seriously? Or is it so new that it must be read immediately and allowed to resonate simply for its novelty, right? That's something that I, still working through my dissertation, that I'm having to repeatedly encounter. And I'd like to go back really quick.
Being heretical and being told you can't write this by
precisely. Being told by mentors that you need to read more old books, or conversely by another mentor, you need to read more new books, right? And it's that combat between former and perhaps more contemporary ways of thinking of disciplining the mind, and also the body. We can't forget that reading is always an embodied activity. Really unfold, at least in our worlds that that I'm most familiar with. But I want to go back to the one comment you made just now, which I think is considerably relevant to the first question I think Alexander posed, and that was regarding the importance of external events to the possibilities for cognitive change and, by extent, social and political change, of course. Because what Kuhn calls anomalies are these things that are inexplicable by the terms of the form of science that in which the anomaly appears, right? And once those accumulate to a certain point, and I don't know what that tipping point is, when the sort of what he calls the disciplinary matrix must be revised and changed, like that set of possible questions and possible answers must be changed. These are external events, but at the same time, according to him, they're not, because like what is even allowed to be an event is predetermined by that disciplinary matrix. It's predetermined by the paradigm itself, by the paradigmatic theory, right? That sort of overrules, that is the umbrella, like you said, of that form of scientific activity. But we see that Kuhn's very theory of the paradigm has infiltrated, bacterialized, if that works, and taken hold in many other fields of thought, acting as an external event on other things, right? And I'm interested in that because that's, I think, what's supposed to be happening with the whole format of the Clandestine talks. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Harmony.
Can everyone hear me? I don't know if this is on right. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Alex.
Hey, how's it going?
We all
It's been a
opened.
long journey.
Nice to talk to you.
Yeah.
I'm glad you made it.
Me too.
We all opened by introducing ourselves.
Oh, cool.
So anyone listening, and I don't know if this is live streaming into the pavilion, into Lara's exhibit.
Oh, hopefully. That's cool.
But maybe if you want
Yeah.
to say a few words about yourself, then.
My name's Harmony Holliday. I live in the U.S. I'm a writer. I also have a background in dance, and I do like some sound and video things here and there, but writer first, I guess. Yeah.
We've been talking down this like rabbit hole a bit that I started because I was trained in history of science. I'm Mara Mills.
Yeah.
About just etymologically looking at the history of the word paradigm in English and how it proliferated and became popularized by Thomas Kuhn's 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions.
Cool.
But there are so many definitions of the word paradigm at this point, popular ones, dictionary ones.
Yeah. And what is the etymology? Because that's one thing I was going to look up on my internet.
Well, his two definitions of it, one are that a paradigm is something like a worldview, and this influenced the development of social constructionism and Foucault's episteme, and the other is just paradigm as like an exemplar, a model, something much smaller.
Yeah.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about the former and like these
the worldview. Yeah, that's
big
usually what
sweeping
people think of.
changes in academic thought, but there's so many other things, and I may be the only person here who actually was able to go to the exhibit. Lara Favaretto's, we are part of the exhibit, but the material exhibit, the storeroom or shelves yesterday, and she has a series of shelves. I think there may be 4 high, and it's like a room, kind of like a bunker, lined with shelves on 3 sides. And there's words on each shelf with objects above them that she constantly rotates. And so the current configuration of objects that she has located above paradigm as objects that somehow symbolize paradigm for her at this moment in time, I could just describe them to everyone here as a way to add on to, but also swerve out of history of science if we wanted.
Yeah, no, I think we're just getting to that.
And also, I don't know. She didn't tell us how she defines paradigm. She gave us a packet of 46 images, and then all I know is this grand pavilion installation. And basically, I was surprised that the word paradigm is on the very bottom shelf in the very far left-hand corner. So, I made the case that the word paradigm is like central to like modern Western academic thinking. But, here she's totally demoted the word paradigm. It's very difficult to find and see. So maybe like part of being the invisible infrastructure is the whole point, or maybe it's just not actually as important of a term to her as other terms are. And the objects located there's like something like a conveyor belt that swirls around 4 statues. 3 of them are busts of toys, and one is a statue of a parrot. And the 3 busts, one is Mickey Mouse, one is some sort of clear like clear plastic head. Maybe it's like an anatomical mold, wearing a motorcycle visor. And then the other one is something like a bust of the like stereotypical mechanical Turk, or the head of Zoltar, the 1950s fairground automaton, something like that. And I was thinking about these heads, and I was like, these are heads, but are they thinking? So we're also, the thinking head is one of the frameworks for this project too. The parrot, I don't know what to make of. Parrots may speak, but they aren't generally granted logical thought. The other objects, can they speak at all? Are they fragments? Are they death masks for a paradigm that once was? Are they proper busts? And if they are busts, what are we supposed to make of a toy bust? Because, you know, busts originated in like ancient Greece as very cheap and quick versions of portraiture. But then by like the Renaissance, they became like upper class European citations of ancient Greece. And, so citations of antiquity in the name of like grandness and permanence, rather than like cheap and quick ways to do a portrait. But now here we have on the paradigm shelf the collectible toy bust. And I'm like, what do I make of this? You know, these are truly, truly cheap materials. They're plastic, adopting the pose of grandeur. They're fakes that are being memorialized. They're action figures that have been beheaded and asked to perform some other kind of work, like to stop feigning animacy. And then there's like the irony of the true permanence of plastic. So I was thinking, I don't know why these are part of the paradigm shelf. Maybe it's because paradigms can't actually be immortalized. They're constantly shifting. And intellect can't be disembodied. Maybe that's what a toy bust teaches us. I don't know. What other readings are there of these toy busts, or of an artistic set of definitions for this word paradigm, or any like everyday smaller definitions?
I'm taken by the word citations there. You refer to busts as being, at one point in history, European citations of Greek civilization.
I'm not trained in art history, so this is there's probably a better way to put this, but it's just there's something just so ridiculous about a toy bust, but there's also something ridiculous about a like drawing room, but like citing something that was actually sort of cheap in its own time as a way to, anyway. Cite might make the wrong one.
Because you said citations, and you said citations, and you said cheap in relative proximity to one another in your sentences, and perhaps that is precisely that. She is making a cheapening of these citations as some sort of analogy for the ways that thought is eventually cheapened through things like through social phenomena like paradigm shifts, as Kuhn describes them, right? A playful but also very serious reflection on the way that things come and go, and eventually take on connotations which would be seen as disrespectful to, you know, the former epistemic way of knowing those things, right? So to have a Mickey Mouse, right, like that, not that it needs any more cheapening. But the question of plastic is also very interesting because it is very durable, right? But I think, and I like to nod to one of my colleagues at York, Angela Cope, who researches the history of plastic. That's not so well known. The reason that plastic is so prevalent in the world, there are specific historical conditions following World War II, and that's very much related to military investment and technological development. But one of the main reasons that plastic became so common in the world today is because it was seen as disposable, even though it was not at all. It's in fact one of the most durable materials that that is available in the world, right?
It's a tragic accident.
A very tragic accident. Another reason was because it's perceived as hygienic, and that has to do with
Also
visual culture of post-World War II American culture and so on and so forth. But it's that that discrepancy between the sort of physical reality of synthetic materials like I'm
like
not
nylon.
recalling the exact polyurethane, right? Which can last thousands of years in the natural environment. And then the socially conditioned perception that this is something that I only need to pay $1 American for, and I'm going to throw it out tomorrow because I can.
Also,
right?
just the idea that disposability is something that we should want in general, as why plastic would have become so popular.
Yeah.
It's definitely a former, paradigm.
Yeah. I think that's tied,
why was that
as far as I
seductive
understood,
in the
and
first
these are
place?
in other conversations, not in bunkers with my colleague I just mentioned. It's very strongly tied to notions of hygiene and ideals of hygiene at that period.
And also capital, because we need to constantly overproduce to have a market.
It's tied to, how is it tied to hygiene exactly? Like as opposed to carrying one unclean vessel around, like you have something that is pristine, that is new, that is manufactured for one use only, and then it will be disposed of.
Right. So I think
so it's just insulated from the world of germs.
Sure. Okay. Well, I preface again by saying I'm not an expert on this. I'm only slightly recalling the way it works in her research, but it's tied to hygiene for that reason, that it can be disposed of immediately. So once it's been infected, there's no worry that the germs and bacteria that are on that material are going to be transferred to your body and cause illness or whatever, because it can be thrown away, right? So it maintains your hygiene by being disposable, the hygiene of the home. Other reasons I think are tied to broader cultural appreciation, visual culture appreciation for shiny, colorful things, to which I couldn't speak anymore. But it was definitely very visible in popular magazines in America in the 1950s. And there are plenty of archival materials that show directly these plastic materials were paradigmatic of cleanliness and ease of maintaining hygiene.
Maybe also just ease and like trying to connote a middle class identity, because the more, I don't know, I think that being able to buy a big thing of plastic water bottles like in the 80s and 90s symbolized a certain kind of middle class. Signifying.
Yeah, a 24 pack.
Yeah, and if you had those,
you have to have a minivan to fit the entire 24 pack in it.
Exactly.
But plastic is one of those, I think.
And don't forget the Capri Sun.
Yep, and the Sunny D.
Capri Sun was tinfoil, wasn't it? Don't tell me I was drinking out of plastic that whole time.
It's all plastic.
They were
foil's even
pouches.
worse.
I think they were like foil-colored plastic pouches, but I'd have to go buy some and to confirm.
Plastic is a weird example of. I think there are competing plastic paradigms. I'm not here. I may be bending the word paradigm far beyond how it should be used, because it may just be like practice, or there's something. The commodity form that plastic has taken is adopted by users in lots of different ways and appropriated in lots of different ways, and there are many different markets. So it might, like, economic terms might be better than paradigm, but I'm thinking of the plastic straw debates.
Yeah.
Many disabled people need plastic straws because they don't melt the way cardboard straws do. There's an environmental, if I can use the word paradigm about like getting rid of plastic straws in the name of decreasing plastic waste. Of course, the plastic dryer is not going to go away from that one step, but it is one positive step. But then not everyone can actually get rid of plastic straws. Some people rely on them,
and they can't be substituted with a kind of metal reusable. No,
there are so many reasons why that doesn't work, and glass straws break, but also for all of one might think that the problem of plastic has become the new paradigm. Like we seem to all agree around this table that there was a false consciousness of people in the previous paradigm thinking that plastic was disposable, and now we know it's disposable / permanent. But actually, plastic is still being produced in huge quantities, and the changed paradigm has not had it seem to have any effect on plastic production.
Well, it's actually embodied now, because now they're finding the first traces of microplastics in human blood.
Right.
because it's already in the blood of sea creatures. So if humans eat that, it's going to go up the food chain, obviously. And so it's kind of like, that's what we are now.
We are plastic.
Radiohead was right.
We're corn chips
and
plastic.
In addition to several small nest building species, and I can't
They've started using them?
Started building.
That's insane.
I can't remember which bird it is, but widespread documentation of them building nests out of fully plastic materials.
Wow.
I mean, can the word paradigm be used beyond? So worldview, like the big definition of paradigm was about thought. It's like worldview, some sort of thought collective sort of thing. And then the smaller definition was more material. It's like, this is a model. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can see how these plastic heads are models of something, or they could be, or an exemplar of something, or mold or something. But actually this idea that plastic it's like a materialized worldview. If like it's in our blood, if we're made of it and nests are made of it, it's like the small version is cannibalizing the big version of paradigm.
Yeah, because we underestimated the staying power of the...
Like the epistemology of plastic doesn't even matter. It's the total ubiquity. Yeah. It's the foundation.
Mm-hmm. And just the fact that it proliferates so much because of that ubiquity, or the fact that it's not disposable, means that we've been... I mean, I guess it's like a proper accumulation strategy for the Western hemisphere. Like it shows how our toxic worldview has accumulated over hundreds of years.
And creating piles of waste and gyres in the southern hemisphere.
Yeah. And literally, I mean, we outsource our trash now because of the problem of plastic. So maybe it does point to other issues with the Western paradigm world. I don't know, I see it almost, when I think of paradigm, I was thinking a lot about mythology too, and how we mythologize purity in the West by throwing all our trash and waste over. I mean, I think, where was it? I think we exported to China, like a lot of our trash.
They've stopped. China has...
and now China stopped, And so now, where are we going to put it? Maybe we'll just actually have to have trash.
Space.
Yeah,
well,
it's true. Mars.
Yeah.
They're platforms for new golf courses.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Landfill.
Yeah, that's an option. As I know, a lot of waste is currently being shipped to Southeast Asia. There's a very widely discussed controversy between Canada and the Philippines.
Yeah, because I saw trash is washing up on their beaches.
Yeah, well, also they had surreptitiously sent something like 200 tons of waste to the Philippines. Like, so there's some shady deals. I don't know the details, so I shouldn't speak to that.
Wow.
And the Philippines
apparently it would be feasible to launch the trash into the sun, but the expense is outlandish.
I think some of it's just floating around on container ships, waste container ships. Yeah. Actually, the lovely part of this experiment is that we have no Wi-Fi in this bunker, so we actually do have to create it. We can we can come up with any theory we want. Let's come to consensus on this.
That's why I'm here.
Oh, that's right. You can be our reality check.
Yeah.
Is that sun theory?
I'm your extension into the world of search engines.
Fact check for us.
We have no Wi-Fi, but we do have plastic.
We do. Interestingly
lots
enough, we do have lots in here. And that's the
the next stage is to build a nest.
Alexander is speaking through plastic, in fact, to us.
Which is really incredible if you think about it. And that you... Mara, you just mentioned again, like the confusion between the two possible definitions of paradigm. One as a worldview, and one as a more microscopic,
a mere example or
model,
a model,
right?
Yeah.
And already, given what Harmony just said, and reminded us about microplastics, we are already embodying plastic through the ingestion of microplastics, be that directly through what we eat. Like, I don't know, microplastics getting in my body just by touching and putting my lips to these things, or eating fish or other animals that have ingested it, collapses those two definitions into one, right? Because the the worldview that plastic is a sustainable, respectable, and just generally good thing to have and use and create, has become that tiny thing that we hold in our hands instead of just our heads. Do you know what I mean?
I know.
Right? That it's that the conceptual thing, the worldview of plastic is now in the body. The body is the model for the model, right? It takes lots of hybridization of them, but or a collapse. I don't know which word is better.
The worldview is an example of something from the past. Yeah. I mean, I almost only use the big definition of paradigm when I use the word paradigm, like framework, worldview.
Same,
and then the smaller definitions, at least the ones I pulled out of these, I was reading through Kuhn and Fleck again, were prototype and mere example. But I know that there are, like I said, someone said there were like 22 definitions of paradigm in Thomas Kuhn's book alone, and undoubtedly in the OED, there's many, many more by now. And I'm not sure, Alexander, do you use this word in any other ways in your work?
No, I mean, it's not, right, it's something I think about very generally, except when I'm reading something like Kuhn who's built an entire theoretical apparatus around a specific or many specific uses of the term.
There are also uses of deployments of the word paradigm in other languages, following the same etymology, spelled more or less the same, right? I think paradigma in Spanish, and as I recall, it simply means model, right? Okay. But it doesn't go to that extent where it would speak to like an entire set of practices that's disseminated widely throughout society. It's just one, like a basic thing, a basic presentation of something bigger.
I mean, I sometimes use the version of the word like paradigmatic for something small.
Yeah.
Like it's not a model, it's just, I used to sometimes say something is a mere example. Like if I'm teaching and I'm like, this is paradigmatic of this.
Yeah.
It's like, this is
a model.
This is an example of this or something,
Yeah.
I don't know how it's used in the art world, if makers of models are using this term in a more concrete way, because my use of the word model is actually metaphoric. It's often a text or a case being an example.
Yeah.
It's not a real model.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think about it to go back to music and sound in terms of a prevailing style that doesn't necessarily foreclose on alternatives, but that does like govern what people produce and tend to view as appealing or acceptable. Which I mean, I've been thinking about this in relation to pop music and specifically production techniques and the kind of information about consumers that contributes to what people produce and how they produce it, which creates can create a very rigid paradigm based on like assessments of what appeals to listeners, what sells, and that has to do with consumption data, but also like neurobiology research and so on. But I mean, I feel like this maybe relates to things that you work on and think about harmony in terms of the pressure, like what governs different, like how people perform and express themselves and for whom, and what that leads to in terms of tensions between what seems possible or viable and what one wants to do beyond those strictures.
Yeah. I think the market definitely determines some of the, like, people can pander to certain paradigms, I think, while also not holding them, in the sense that that's how in some of my work, about sound and music, I think a lot specifically about the paradigms of Black music and sound within like the diasporic culture and how those shift based on, for example, at first the need to get off of a plantation out of certain economic situations, and then once you get into a certain economic situation, how that might change. How, for example, the minstrel went away once that kind of entertainment wasn't a contingency for liberation. But it didn't exactly go away because there is still some of that contingent, access to power through flagrant entertaining that Black people use as one of our points of access, I guess. So yeah, I think in a way, for certain cultures, a paradigm represents the illusion that we play up to in order to survive, in a sense. Like you see Southeast Asians and Black people and Chinese people in the U.S. adopting a paradigm that they don't believe in certain settings, especially academic settings, Western academic.
And you recognize it as something you can slot yourself into strategically, but not something that
and you might not
makes
even
thinking or acting differently impossible.
It doesn't if you do it consciously. It just depends on how deeply it's in your subconscious. But I think a lot of us who don't come only from a Western background might have the experience that I've had of you're able to wake up from a certain paradigm and realize what you've been doing at a certain point, usually in college or graduate school, like, oh, we never learned any history from another culture, so I never thought like this. And that's where, to bring it to popular culture, you see like what's happening in football with Marshawn Lynch and the other guy, like two people. I was thinking about this the other day, kind of in relation to this. It's a strange, far out example, but it's two Black male football players who got into Berkeley for their talent as football players, but ended up being militant and then brought that into American football. And then you see that now there's this resistance and this taking a knee thing. And I think that's a direct paradigm shift happening where people probably went to regular public school, didn't know that they were kind of being indoctrinated in a certain Western paradigm, and then get somewhere. I took the same class. It's the one African history class at Berkeley, and then you're like, oh damn, I have a new paradigm now. Like, what about Africa? But your whole life you've been denied any information about this because you are, promptly told to read every text from Moby Dick to whatever. And I think I read one Toni Morrison book, An Invisible Man, in high school, but no one's ever like. So then, for example, me doing rhetoric, which is more like philosophy at UC Berkeley, and reading Foucault and Derrida and all those people, where the foundational class was Greek mythology. My question to that professor as like an 18-year-old was like, well, what about why is a foundational myth of all rhetoric Greek mythology and not Egyptian mythology or something? Because this is just another culture's mythology. And they were like, we're done with you. Like, they didn't know what to do with me. So that was that. But I think it's somehow, I guess that brings us to like maybe how is paradigm related to class struggle and race struggle and just struggle in general outside of class and race, because it is, I feel like, a struggle for dominance. Whoever has a dominant paradigm is inadvertently or, consciously acting out their mythology on the rest of the world.
We haven't talked about competing paradigms. I mean, the people who started theorizing paradigms like Kuhn, 50, 60 years ago, were talking about competing paradigms within one teeny tiny community and how one gets overthrown. But there are lots of other kinds of competing paradigms. And did you study African history with Abena Oseo-Asare at Berkeley?
I took one class.
Was she the professor?
It was a male professor. Okay. That wasn't the professor. Yeah, I wish
she taught there for a while, and I went to grad school with her in history of science, and she's now at UT Austin, I think, and unless she moved again. But her book, her award-winning book, actually I think she might have two books now, but her award-winning first book is on plant knowledge and like herbal medicinal expertise in Ghana and the way it was appropriated by Western pharma. And so there are two not quite competing paradigms, but Venn diagram paradigms, but one clearly has more power to appropriate knowledge and to turn it into monetize it and turn it into commodities. So yeah, there are competing paradigms, many of them, and paradigms have money and power attached to them, not just inside those worldviews, but as they engage with other ones.
Is a condition of paradigm formation capital and economics? Because I feel like in Ghana, for example, shamans and people who are master herbalists might not even be considered as having a paradigm. In a sense, they have a body of knowledge and a tradition and a legacy, but I don't think that, I don't know, maybe paradigm forming is always somehow intentional. Like pharma is a paradigm for how all medicinal things should be applied, and it's a paradigm based on economics and what you can patent, and you can take some strain of an herb and patent it, whereas these people in Ghana aren't even doing, there's a more holistic approach, so it's not, I don't know, is paradigm formation something that the West is sort of most implicit in?
Is the paradigm concept as it stands now, like, just, utterly white and Western? When Kuhn was saying the word paradigm, he was applying it to past Western scientists, mostly European scientists, who would never have used the word for themselves. Yeah. And he launched social constructivism, which had huge. He was one of the people. The others, Piaget, Foucault, many others were part of this. But he, that had huge impacts on gender studies, critical race studies, even as these fields have now moved beyond. They're still in that. Social constructionism is still a relevant paradigm, but most people aren't using those terms. Yeah. In critical theory and in activism. But the question is, are we not asking about the limitations of paradigm now that many critical scholars are self-aware of this concept? Mm-hmm. And I guess, are people using the word paradigm self-consciously in industry or the sciences? At this point, I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like it ties into imperialism in some way, because I don't think outside of Western thought cultures are thinking, even if you're not using the word paradigm to describe your overarching model and worldview, I don't think the desire to proliferate a worldview is common to every, you know what I mean? Like people have their worldviews, and the idea of wanting to spread them and then therefore create wealth with that is not common to every culture, I don't think. Or is it? I don't know. Thinking about it, it seems like the concept of a paradigm is necessary to create a hierarchy of worldviews. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know the roots of, I actually don't know the etymology of paradigm. I just know its early uses in English, and obviously it sounds like it came from the Greek. Yeah, I know.
What's up with that online etymology?
But at first in English, it was used.
That seems like it might take me a while.
Yeah, that's true.
But it was used at first in linguistics, so it was just, and it was, I think, applied to every language. Again, if you believe in the idea that all the sort of Chomskyan idea that all languages spring from the same source, which is not social constructivist, but but the idea is the paradigm was just a declension chart for verbs, and it could be applied to any language, and it was so a paradigm would be a pattern of sameness with difference. Okay. And no one ever theorized, maybe linguists do, but no one outside of linguistics ever theorizes from that definition of paradigm, which is actually kind of an interesting one, that one can take a word, that one could take an object and transform it, but never fully wrench it from its history or from its material source or something like that.
Yeah.
But this other version, this like post-Kuhnian version of paradigm is maybe, I don't know if it's always tied to capitalism, but it could always be tied to imperialism. I had mentioned before you got here, Harmony, that Kuhn was inspired by Fleck, and Fleck had come up with his precursor to the paradigm, which is this idea of thought collectives, based on his studies of syphilis. But syphilis and syphilology, the understanding of syphilis, is thoroughly colonial and then post-colonial, because the story in Western medicine starting in the 15th century was always that Columbus or his crew brought syphilis back from the Americas. And then there have been a series of debates about whether that's a pathologizing notion of a racist notion about coming from Europe or whether...
They brought mad diseases here, first of all.
Yeah. So there is something about the beginnings of this way of thinking, starting in Fleck, that definitely is thoroughly rooted in ideas of race and place.
Yeah.
But I think there's more to be said about how the word paradigm is used and what its limitations are.
Yeah. I'm going to say this several times over the course of the remaining course of today's engagement, but this bunker situation is like really nicely generative. We just found a limitation, a border, a horizon for, I did at least, I'll say, due to the social pressures that you're giving me with your words, with capital, because the second you asked if it can be tied to capitalism, when we think about paradigms can be tied to capitalism, well, sure, but then I'm still, because of my background, I'm still sort of stuck to the scientific version of the paradigm. But then when you mentioned that, I recalled a paper I had heard presented once, which told the story of the recent history, and by that I mean from the 1990s to the mid-2000s, of a pharmaceutical company following a scientific and capitalist paradigm, was looking for a location to conduct experiments in order to better develop certain drugs for certain genetic treatments. The place they found was an isolated island somewhere in the South Pacific, which had a policy of non-interference with any outside economic or foreign or colonial forces. They refused to open themselves up to tourism. They refused to open themselves to any commercial exchange with any outsiders, without exception. But after some pressure, repeated attempts by the pharmaceutical company to allow them to go to the island, and I'll mention why this island was useful, is because they had been isolated genetically from the rest of humanity for an improbably lengthy amount of time, right? So that's when they were seen as a useful resource for understanding the way genetics work, because it was a notion of purity that they embodied, right? And so it was an undisturbed laboratory for the exploration of genetic insight, right? Of genetic experimentation. And the forces of capitalism and science, two different paradigms tied together in the form of the pharmaceutical company, eventually succeeded in convincing them, obviously through lavish gifts, through lavish amounts of capital, right, thrown at them, to let the company in, and the islanders eventually did. And that place, which once was one thing, had its own paradigm for social and political interaction, which was essentially a set of refusals. I refuse to let you come to our island to do what you like. It's our island. It's our place. That paradigm was toppled by that marriage of science and capital. Again, two paradigms in and of themselves. Yeah, so there are limitations that we can break through.
You're making me realize that the story of Kuhn's paradigm as disrupting the prior linear progressive notion of science, that there's just been an accumulation of discoveries since the scientific revolution, and we get closer and closer to the truth by following the scientific method. Actually, it would be very easy to appropriate that term in the name of like thinking outside the box. If the paradigm is the box, or like, oh hey, anyone can create a scientific revolution. Anyone can create a technological revolution. I mean, again, I don't work on innovation studies, and I don't study Silicon Valley, and I don't know how this word is being used in industry, but I could see that it could easily like flip the original intention of it on its head. I mean, Kuhn is looking at Newton. He's looking at a moment that's before industrial capitalism and early days of capitalism compared to today. And not to say that it wasn't tied to capitalism then, I'm sure we can find plenty of links, but I would imagine that the way the word is being used now could be this, like, could be completely about creating revolutions in the name of selling.
Move fast and break paradigms.
Yeah, and I mean, is the big idea of like the paradigm as the mold that like all of our thought is locked in versus the paradigm as the mold that like one kind of product or one strain of music is locked in. Those are very different scales. Yeah. You can't really manipulate the other one. But I like with music, I was wondering as Alex and Harmony were talking, like what's the difference between paradigm and genre?
Alex, do you?
I mean, I guess I was thinking of a paradigm like more in terms of how the production of music creates or emerges from a feedback loop that has to do with data on consumption habits, like new technologies, and also research on how people respond to certain stimulus, especially on a neurobiological level. And to me, that technique, that way of conceiving of listeners and of how to satisfy them or how to get them to consume something isn't limited to genre. It has more to do with with a technological system that incorporates and reinforces ideas about who people are and what they want or what they respond to. And I think that that system might be like producing more of one genre than the other, but there's no reason to tie it to genre because it's it can because right, it's not like genres are not so rigid, and I think are effectively like marketing tools or ways of communicating to specific demographic groups. For instance, like what defines you and what defines you in relation to others who are slightly different from you in terms of like performance styles and historical, cultural lineages that you subscribe or don't subscribe to.
I think specifically with jazz music, it's a good example of all those things Alex is talking about and how both definitions of paradigm operate, because when it came into be, it was completely instrumental and analog, not electronic. And then as electronic instruments have become more popular, maybe Herbie Hancock would be one of the first people to play like actually probably Sun Ra, like a Wurlitzer and a Fender Rhodes, as opposed to a regular piano. But as far as the production goes, there's because it's a music that's not really market driven so much, it can't really be because it's not that popular, although in some ways it is. Like Miles Davis was a master of the market, but he was also, most people who make jazz music do it more for their health and their idea of community. But then there are the paradigms of people not wanting it to turn electronic versus people wanting it to, and does the genre get to be called what it is if it now does not, if it's digitally produced, if it's produced on machines, is it still jazz music? And then the definition having to shapeshift and really become more focused on collective improvisation, which in my opinion is kind of the overarching paradigm of that music.
Right.
So then it just becomes improvised music, and that in a way becomes a cultural paradigm, because you're talking about celebrity making versus the idea of a group working together. And then it's a good example. It shows kind of how the market then takes over, because the market wants a celebrity. So when you see jazz LPs, there's always usually a name, they make stars out of people because that's what the market does. But I think that the idea of a band leader is not part of the jazz paradigm. It's part of the other paradigm. So I don't know, it's a good thing to look at. I always look at it because I just research it a lot, and because it shows the struggle between paradigms in a way.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't. It's hard to imagine a quantitative model that can be applied to collective improvisation in order to enable people to effectively determine what people want when they listen to that, and how to reproduce it or automate it. I mean, computers aren't very good at improvising.
Yeah.
Or generative algorithms are not the same as improvisation.
Well, I think part of that is because it's a form that's for the practitioner and not the audience in a way. And that's not something we're used to in music, as ritual music in general, not just jazz. It's for the people playing it too, but the paradigm we're in, music is supposed to be for sale and for entertainment for other people. But we don't really talk about because you don't think Miley Cyrus is making music for her health. She's obviously trying to get money. But I think a lot of musical forms are for the practitioner, and then they become confusing within the dominant paradigm about sales and stuff.
Yeah, and they don't emerge from a market model or from a market incentive.
Totally.
There's it's music that predates, or forms of expression that predate that, and that will persist long after
Beyond
that.
It,
that paradigm is gone.
Yeah. Are there other things like that in beside? I don't know.
This is reminding me of some of the arguments Sumanth Gopinath and Alexander Wahelia make about ringtones, which is a paradigm that came and went. If we can use the word paradigm for that, ringtone music, which crosses many genres, and Sumanth's book on the ringtone, looks at the confluence of technology and markets, and then Alexander Wahelia looks at the feedback, actually, to use your word, Alex, of the shortness of ringtone loops back into different genres of music, so that music starts to be performed with in order to make ringtones, or with a ringtone aesthetic. So I don't know if something like the ringtone, which combines politics and genres and performance and markets, it could be a paradigm in a slightly different way. I guess it's mesoscale paradigm, not like a massive paradigm shift, but bigger than just a small example changing.
Mm-hmm.
It does point us back to comments that Alexander and Harmony have just made regarding the relationship between technology and these musical paradigms, right? In the ringtone example, that's immediately foregrounded. In music production and the consideration of consumption patterns in the establishment of generic forms of music, technology is always obviously at play. If you think about something like auto-tune, it is a question, the prevalence of auto-tune in a lot of popular music seems to me to be a question, like you said, Alexander, driven by research into what people, who they think they are, and what they respond to, right? But when you look at the practitioner in the case of autotune, it's also a question of what they can do, right? Can that singer hit the right note at the right time, every time? Are they a trained singer at all, or do they rather fulfill some requirements of celebrity making, as you mentioned, instead? And there's a compromise made there that autotune can fill. And then, of course, you have bedroom producers who are throwing autotune all over themselves without the question of celebrity making, although they might be striving towards that. But again, it's the technology that enables any and all of those situations, I think. And then with jazz, too, as far as I understand the history of jazz music, and in addition to it being an art form, a cultural form, which revolves around the sort of self-directed action of the practitioner for feeling good, and it is about collective improvisation, right? And also the rejection of all sorts of conventional Western musical norms, right, in terms of scale and whatnot. it is the way that we understand jazz historically is part and parcel of recording technology.
Yep.
Right. There was a time when jazz did sell well, and when there was a thriving community of recording engineers in Los Angeles and New York who specialized in making jazz understandable to wider publics through changing the placement of room mics, amplification levels, the dynamics and whatnot of different instrumentalists, and achieving the form that we understand jazz to be historically now, because because that is a sound reproduction technology which gives us access to that moment in time. All that to say that technology seems to be here, and it's something that Kuhn didn't ever get to, right? The determining nature of tools and equipment in generating what we might perceive as merely conceptual or more conceptual models for thinking and being.
But he has a couple of sections on like the Leyden jar. There are a few tools in there, but the thing is, he wouldn't be neither of these early like user or Kuhn, the main early proliferator of this word. I don't think they would have wanted to be technologically determinist.
No.
So because then it's not a paradigm; it's just a technologically driven shift. It has to be like bigger.
Exactly.
It has to. Because some of it is conscious and some of it is unconscious. You mentioned habitus in your very opening remarks, and some of the training that we do as we learn an instrument or learn a style or become disciplined in a field or an academic field or other field is conscious training, but so much of it is it becomes unconscious or is always unconscious. And with tool use, as you learn to use a new tool in your field, whether it's a new instrument, whether it's a new piece of software, some of that is conscious and unconscious as well. So and there has to be more than just the technology driving, I think. There has to be something broader. Definitely. Socially, there have to be social determinants as well for it to fit into at least the old-fashioned definition of paradigm. If I so wish that one of my students who is an expert in computing were here, because I suspect the word paradigm might be used in software or in programming. Like, let's switch to this paradigm, like as like a building block that can be rotated in and out. I think there probably are like purely technical uses of this term now. But I know
there are for prototypes, but which is a related term, right? Prototypes being, I think, series of filters in networks that you can layer sort of filter cutoffs on top of one another, so you get them sharper and sharper and sharper and sharper. So, if we use an acoustic metaphor, we could stop a sound at 1,000 hertz. Right, and we have a different slope on a filter, and we remove what's above or below that frequency, right? And then I think in electronics and which is these filters are all digital, so I don't know if it turns to programming or not. You put that same filter on top of itself many times, and if you drop it a certain level on the first level, then this much of what is supposed to be there is gone, and then you put another filter underneath that or above that. What sort of topology do you want to follow here? Right, it just gets clearer and clearer and clearer. I think that's called prototyping, but I don't know whether that's relevant to your question in any way.
Well, there's the cynical part of me wants to see this word paradigm literally just becoming a tool. It would just be one of those like reversals of etymology, where something becomes a contronym of itself, where it's like something that starts as either a worldview or an example of something becomes just the tool that's making cookie cutter versions of a sound or an object.
I think I said very quickly at the beginning that I was concerned that my interactions with the term, with that concept, are intimidating to the extent that I feel it's become just a tool like you're describing. Should we just throw it out and stop talking about paradigms?
I mean,
I want to know when I use it, because I use it unconsciously.
Same, I think. I think talking about it is a way to leverage something usually, but otherwise I feel like it's not talked about that much. You know, I think in pop culture, people use, like, the word groupthink somehow got out, and I feel like people use that word when they mean what, like, academics mean by paradigm.
Hive
groupthink,
mind.
yeah, like, that's where I see it operating in pop culture. I think a lot of people are thinking about groupthink in terms of social media and in terms of just televisual, audiovisual cultures, and what and how to extract from it, I guess. Alex, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, Harmony, before you were here, I was just talking a little bit about, like, how paradigms might be understood in, like, in terms of political action and theory on the popular level, and the term Overton window, which has been bandied about quite a lot recently, came to mind, which just describes what kind of ideas are, you know, seem politically viable or are likely to be entertained by most people, or eventually enacted at a given time. And, you know, there are various, like, people who subscribe to the idea that there is a thing called the Overton window that determines what ideas are viable, like, you know, essentially advocate for, like, aggressively presenting ideas even if they seem, like, totally illegitimate at a point, because, like, there's no better alternative if you want those ideas to become legitimate sooner rather than later. And, you know, there are, like, pretty mundane examples, like universal healthcare today,
news.
where, yeah. And so, I mean, I think that's like an example of how paradigm, or a comparable term, operates on in a more, like, on a popular level, but in a more circumscribed manner, like, you know, having to do with one specific area, which is, like, electoral, like, political discourse and elections. I also wanted to say that I'm going to have to step out in a sec, so I'm just going to slip out without interrupting you to signal when that's happening. But I might not be able to fact check or Google beginning soon.
Is your doorbell ringing, or is that sound coming from inside the bunker?
Oh, sorry, that's a teapot.
Oh, okay.
Oh, cool.
We have a teapot here, too.
Yeah. Teapot.
Really?
It's very silent.
Transcontinental teapot.
It's so homey out. Someone should move in.
To the bunker. Yeah, it'd be safe.
Okay, I'm gonna mute myself now.
Okay.
Then we really won't know when he's...
Yeah.
Because we can tell from his
Yeah,
breathing
like
and
how he's
talking.
thinking. Yeah. That's also cool that that's a thing. Sound is very cool.
It
And
is.
that's, you know what I mean? So,
Yes.
like, energetic field.
It'll be sad when noise is eliminated from our circuits. It tells us so much.
Yeah,
We
we
need that
need-
noise. I
yeah.
really do need some signal that just from, like, the, like, random
Yeah.
movements of the electromagnetic
interesting.
spectrum in my ear to, like, know that he's alive and he's there.
Oh yeah, that
You
that
know?
particular noise.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, I'm worried about him at this point. It's been,
With
been almost a
muteness.
minute.
It's
of
interesting.
A sheer silence.
For Triple Canopy, the like the publication he runs with them, he's back. I'm talking about muteness, or I'm writing about muteness, like a piece on elective muteness, it's called, where people choose to go silent. And it turns out, I guess, thinking about it and thinking about paradigm, that in a way, speech itself, I feel like that was him leaving.
I
Yeah.
think that was.
Yeah. Bye, Alex. Maybe he'll come back. In a way, speech itself is a paradigm, is what I guess that I'm coming to learn with that writing.
There's so much.
Or the idea of like not using language. We don't think that we can. There are certain things. I guess maybe one way paradigms operate is that we believe that certain things are mandatory, certain functions, and not they aren't. For example, you don't have to speak. You know what I mean? Like, we grew up, a lot of people would not think to stop speaking or not even think about that as a capacity, but it's not even that. So I think in a way, I don't know if there's another word like above paradigms, but there has to be some, or maybe paradigms encapsulates this idea that like of certain mandates, whether they be like genetic or social or political.
Well, whether it's a paradigm or not, I like the idea of all the forms of, I mean, in technology studies, people study non-use as much as they study use now. Yeah. So like rejection, resistance, exclusion.
Failure too.
So many ways that you can not use a technology. There's a whole array of them. So I don't know if that's a paradigm in technology studies or a paradigm of the technology use, or if we can throw the word paradigm out in that case. But like in disability studies, a lot of recent scholars have talked about elective disability. And because that needs to be talked about. Dominant paradigm, I'm not 100% sure we need the word paradigm here, but the stereotype would be that no one wants to be disabled because it's such a stigmatized category. But in fact, many people throughout history have elected impairment and disability for different reasons, whether it's, Susan Schweik writes about disability fakers in like New York in the 1920s, the Gangs of New York book and now movie, and many people were disability fakers to panhandle, to like malingering.
Also, it's an identity, and people are addicted to a certain identity politic once they start, you know what I mean, whether it be an oppressed one or not, people get into a place where they want to signify, because now the whole popularity and like over, people empty terms, but like the idea of virtue signaling, and it's kind of a way to virtue signal in a sense. I've been trying to write about people voguing mental illness and just what's happened with social media and the popularity of like go to therapy as like a comment that, just this like, and also people just will go on social media and say I'm bipolar, or say, I've seen people say the most outlandish, just like confessional politicking, and it's kind of feigning disability, the people who go on and talk about like all sorts of mental illness on social media. And a similar thing sometimes happens with people who have disabilities that you can't see, like Asperger's and things like that. There's a lot of elective claiming of that now, it seems like, or just claiming of it, which is, claiming is fine. It's weird when it's aggressively pushed at you. Because, I mean, in a way, coming from a, whatever, I hate the word minority, but, quote unquote minority position, it's like one that you can't claim based on skin. It's weird. I guess that's what makes it weird for me to think, like, why would you claim something that oppresses you? Because you walk out every day and you already got this stigma on, you know what I mean? So I don't relate to it in that sense. Do you know what I mean? It's like...
disability is such a huge umbrella category.
Yeah, and it's difficult.
Even within it, like blindness is an umbrella, deafness is an umbrella. There's many of each of them, and oh my gosh, I could talk for hours on this topic.
And the idea of wellness versus unfitness, like, is also like in a lot of ways subjective, because there are a lot of crazy people, like for example, the president of the United States, who are running things. So it's like. He has mad disabilities, so it's weird. Elective not claiming of them too is a thing, I guess.
There's probably a need for a whole like taxonomy of the ways that one for things that go under the rubric of elective disability, because there's all these old-fashioned terms like malingering, but there's the new set of them. There's a few books that have come out on this. I don't know if the word paradigm ever gets attached to any of those words. I was just thinking to myself, I think I have heard the phrase technical paradigm. Like, I think I have heard that. So my whole argument I made a minute ago about paradigm not being able to be applied as a technologically determinist word, I think actually it is. I mean, am I just like hallucinating now, having spent 2 hours in this bunker? But I think technical paradigm is something that's become like a common phrase.
It could be. I'm aware of social construction of technology scholars developing what they call technological frame, which is it's the exact same thing as Kuhn's paradigm. I think it's they even cite Kuhn in talking about that. But it sets a technological frame sets a possible mode of action for a social group, right? An appropriate use of a technology, and then all the attendant practices that follow the appropriate use of that technology. And I don't know if that's what you're referring to with
Frame?
technical paradigm.
No, but actually, why not use the word frame? I mean, I think frame comes from Goffman, same
Yeah.
time period. I mean, so many episteme, frame, paradigm. So many people at this moment in the '60s were coming up with some concept related to what we later called social constructionism. I'm not sure if frame is a better word because it's so. It could actually be. It almost seems like it's applicable to more things, and it doesn't have the bizarre weightiness.
I think that was the point with that field of field of study with social construction technology. The problem with the paradigm was that it was only meant ever to describe what was happening in science. But because our world is so technologically textured, we are always like inextricably embedded in a technological world. Using that term, technological frame, like you said, it opens up that concept to so many other different practices, to so many other social groups and what they're doing, right? Without containing it to the epistemological concern, how knowledge is developed. Well, there are so many other forms of knowledge out there, be it auditory communication being a form of knowledge, as Julian Enriquez writes so beautifully, or performance, dance as a very certain form of knowledge, right, of the body and of your relationship with of people around you, and you could speak a lot more about that than I could. But yeah, so I think that was the whole point. Using frame was a way to loosen it up, like loosen up that way of thinking about thinking, and allow this modeling of model to be
I mean, if we're not
elsewhere.
talking about thought and epistemology, do we even need the word paradigm? I think it has. I think it's morphed into these other uses. I was thinking also before you got here, Harmony. I was thinking about some of the images in that pamphlet or packet that Lara gave us, and there are a couple examples of fads, things called fads that she has in the paradigm packet. And so also what you're describing on social media, when something becomes a meme or a fad or a hook, or there's lots of other words for this, are those words enough, or do we, or does some other word like paradigm get placed on top of them, or is it enough to just say this is a meme and this is a hook and this is...
Well, I think the question of, what were you going to say?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly, just the question of those memes and fads, for me at least, is sincerity. So, like, I guess that's how I catalog them in my mind. Like, if something becomes a meme and it enhances sincerity, does that ever happen? I don't know. That is less common, but I feel like the problem is that when something becomes a meme, and maybe that meme is coming from a paradigm, like let's say the paradigm is that Western therapy works, and then it becomes this fad of like people, this echo chamber of everyone go to therapy, which is very common on social media now, and